All right. Tonight, we are so grateful to welcome Rabbi Saul J. Berman, professor of Jewish law at Yeshiva University and at Columbia University Law School. Rabbi Berman was arrested in civil rights demonstrations in Selma in 1965 and has remained active in the fight for civil rights for almost 60 years. From the March on Selma to the Voting Rights Act and thousands of flashpoints in between, the activists of 1965 helped to reshape our country for the better. But as we all know, we still have such a long way to go. It's our hope we can internalize the lesson learned from the past and from our Jewish tradition in order to commit to furthering a just society today. Rabbi Berman's scholarship and insight will help us remain rooted in our highest ideals while committed to action to create an equitable society for all. We are so lucky that Rabbi Berman will speak to us for 30 minutes on the biblical perspective on a citizen's duty to vote and duty to protest in a democratic society, and then open up the floor to 30 minutes of questions. The MLK Week Committee, the Office of Spiritual Life, and Hillel at IC are thrilled to welcome you, Rabbi Berman.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Thank you for your warm welcome. And thank you to Lauren and to Omega and to Geraldo for having coordinated this program. It's my pleasure to be back in Ithaca without having to wear boots and the heaviest coat that is available to me by either loan or in any other way. So it's a lot easier this way. On the other hand, not getting the opportunity to meet you in person, in actually, so to speak, in the flesh, is a different kind of experience. But it is my pleasure to meet all of you. So I would like to start my comments, in fact, with a part of my experience in Selma in 1965. Which some of you may have heard me speak about. I don't think that I spoke about this particular element of my experience last time I was there, but it's an important piece that will help me frame what it is that I have to say about the significance of voting and of protest. In the summer of 1965, and not the summer, I'm sorry, in March of 1965, in the week just prior to the march from Selma to Montgomery, I and a group of 4 other rabbis from Northern California came to Selma to participate in demonstrations related to voting rights for Blacks, and to do whatever else we could in the expectation that we would also remain there and be able to participate in the march itself. On the same day that we arrived, before we had a chance to put our stuff any place or anything, one of the participating sponsoring groups mentioned that they were going to be doing a protest in front of the home of the mayor of Selma, Mayor Smitherman, and invited us to join them at that protest. And so the 2 of us who had 2 of the 5 of us who had made it in on that sort of early ride participated in that demonstration, and we were arrested for violation of a local ordinance which banned any form of public demonstrations in the white neighborhoods of Selma. I mean, literally, that was the language of the ordinance. We ended up being arrested, and we were put in a sort of a holding area of the prison, pending our being booked. While we were there, a police officer came into the room in which about 125 of us or so were sitting around, and he asked whether there was a Rabbi Gunbiner present. He had previously come in to ask whether there was a Rabbi Berman present. That's a whole other story, but came and he asked for a Rabbi Gunbiner. I knew that Rabbi Gunbiner was there because Rabbi Jacob Gunbiner, was actually sitting right next to me. He was my colleague from Berkeley. He was the Hillel rabbi at the University of California at Berkeley. I was the rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue in the town of Berkeley. I was also a graduate student, and so I had, sort of knowledge of Rabbi Gunbiner, both as a colleague and as a student at the university, taking advantage of the Hillel resources. Rabbi Gunbiner said, like looked at me and he said, like, don't acknowledge that I'm here, because he's not saying that he's there. The police officer walked around. Eventually, he came right up to Rabbi Gunbiner, basically because he saw he was sitting right next to me and figured rabbis would probably hang out together. And he was also wearing a kippah, and he pointed to him and he said, "Are you Rabbi Gunbiner?" And he said, "Yes, I'm Rabbi Gunbiner." So he said, "Well, you're coming with me." Rabbi Gunbiner said, "No, I'm not coming. Actually, I'm staying right here." I must say that the level of fear that existed at that point in time was immense, realistic fear, and so he was not going to go out sort of being taken out alone. The police officer said, "Well, yes, you're coming with me. The only question is whether you're going to come walking or you're going to come being dragged by your foot. So that's up to you. But one way or another, you're coming out." So he said, "Well, I'm not going out alone." So I said that I would come out with him. And then another person on the other side of him also said, actually another rabbi from another city said he would also come with him. So the three of us went out. So why was Rabbi Gunbiner being called out? He was being called out because he had not told any of us actually at that point that when he was first ordained approximately 25 years earlier, when he was first ordained as a rabbi at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, that his first pulpit was as the rabbi of the Reformed Temple of Selma, Alabama. And apparently, someone had reviewed the list of names of the people who had been arrested, noted the name Gunbiner, informed someone in the Jewish community that there was a Rabbi Gunbiner who had been arrested, and the leadership of the Jewish community of Selma asked for an opportunity to meet with Rabbi Gunbiner. Since there were three of us who had gone out, they agreed they would meet with the three of us together. And so there were 3 or 4 representatives of the local Reform Temple and basically of the Jewish community of Selma. It was at that time, the only synagogue in Selma. So sat down with us. We didn't know what they wanted to talk about, but they sat down with us to have a conversation. The police brought us into a small office, and the 7 of us sat around the table. At which point, this leadership of the Jewish community in Selma said to us as follows. They said, we understand that you've come here for a righteous purpose, that you want to help Blacks gain the vote, you want to help them gain some degree of economic independence. Those are all good things, and we have no complaint to you about that. However, it's really vital for you to leave now. So we're sort of taken aback. We said, why is that? And they said, well, well, you may not know, they said, that for the past 6 months, the Black community of Selma has been conducting a boycott of white-owned stores. And we, the leadership of the Jewish community of Selma, pretty much we're all in business here. We have small stores, we're in retail. And so our economic condition has been under great threat. But now, because of the large numbers of rabbis and other overtly Jewish people who have come to Selma to protest and to join the Blacks in their efforts to gain civil rights, now even our non-Jewish white neighbors are boycotting us, not only economically, but even socially. People we've known for 20 or 30 years will no longer talk to us in the streets, will no longer respond when we call them. Our lives have become intolerable here. Both our economic and social conditions are deeply undermined, and you need to leave. you just need to leave, right? We are your fellow Jews, and you're putting us in an extraordinarily compromised position. So that was their message to us. And it set off a conversation that lasted a number of hours. I won't subject you to all of that conversation, but that was their core claim to us. Our core response to them was as follows. We said that it's 1965. It's only 20 years after the Holocaust. During these past 20 years, we have been telling the Christian communities of most of the countries of Europe that responsibility for the Holocaust does not reside only with Hitler, nor just with the SS, or even just with Germany. Responsibility for the Holocaust lies with all of those good Christian citizens of the variety of countries, including Germany, but of the variety of countries that Germany conquered, who back in the early 30s, when the pressure against Jews was just economic and it was social, before Jews were being arrested and imprisoned and then sent to concentration camps, when the synagogues were sometimes being attacked, but they were not being killed in the streets. And during that period of time, Christian leadership was telling their followers that they should not be overtly in support of Jewish interests, because it would result in their social and economic isolation. I mean, Pope Pius XII overtly told Catholic priests throughout Europe that while they can secretly try to help Jews and hide Jews, which many of them did, and saved many lives, that they should not make any public statements about opposition to the treatment of Jews. Because after all, in many of these countries, Catholics were a minority. And if they were to be seen as protesting against the treatment of Jews, they would suffer economic and social isolation within their communities. So, and that's what happened, of course. Good Christians remained silent throughout the early 30s until things had progressed so far that their silence was no longer relevant, because even if they spoke out, then it wouldn't have made any difference. But it might have made a difference in those early years. So in consequence of that, we, the Jewish community, have been telling all of these countries that they share in the responsibility for the Holocaust because of their silence at a stage of the antagonism to Jews, when the only risk they would have been taking would have been a social and economic risk. They would not have been risking their lives. So we said to our fellow Jews in Selma, so what is it that you would like us now to tell all of the populations of these countries? That when Christians are antagonistic to other Christians, that when Christians are antagonistic to Jews, that it's not right for other Christians to remain silent, right? That when Christians are antagonistic to Jews, it is not right for other Christians to remain silent in the face of those forms of anti-Semitism. They have to speak out, even if it would cost them something in their economic and social conditions. But when Christians oppress like Black fellow Christians, that we Jews have the right to remain silent in order to protect the economic and social conditions of other Jews? Really? Is that right? I mean, is that what we're supposed to say? Is that what we really believe? Now, the conversations were extraordinarily difficult and became very heated. And we parted after a number of hours with us telling them that we had no intention of leaving. That on the other hand, if they felt that their conditions were becoming untenable, that we would do everything that we could in terms of reaching out to the leadership of the American Jewish community to see to it that they were provided with economic support, or if they felt that they had to leave, that they would be provided with the means to relocate elsewhere. But that we could not say that we would not engage in protest on behalf of Blacks in the United States because it would impact on either our or the economic and social conditions of other Jews. So what's the background to that? I mean, that's what happened. I mean, we remained there and we continued our protest. They were deeply unhappy with us, but we were not able to convince them. They were not able to convince us. So what's the background to that? That is, what is it that moved us to be able to say with such clarity that that's how we felt and that that's what we needed to do? So one major piece of that is the following. I mean, if anyone would tell you that the Bible, the Torah, does not have a social and political agenda, then you should tell them just to read Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19, in just a series of approximately 10 verses, lays out an extraordinary responsibility, an extraordinary range of responsibilities of individual citizens for the character of the society within which they live. It starts out, you can tell them to read from verses 9 through 18. That's all they have to read, because those 10 verses contain the following: that there is a duty to support the poor, that there is a deep respect that one has to have for private property, but it's not permissible to engage in any form of economic fraud. It is not permissible to engage in lying. It is not permissible for a believer in God to engage in an activity which would reflect badly on God, which would debase the name and reputation of God, to engage in chilul Hashem, of desecration of the divine name. That it is not permissible to engage in the crime of oshek. Oshek is a distinctive crime which the Bible forbids. It involves the emotional exploitation of vulnerable people. It is not permissible to engage in the verbal, even emotional exploitation of vulnerable people, right? That it is a crime to rob from people, that it is not permissible to delay paying employees, particularly day laborers, that there is a duty to protect the disabled, neither to curse the deaf nor to place a stumbling block before the blind, and that one has to live a life which manifests a sense of awe before the authority of God. That's only halfway through the chapter, halfway through these 10 verses. That it is impermissible to allow injustice to occur in the society, that judges may not practice any form of favoritism in judgment, neither favoritism toward the wealthy nor favoritism toward the poor, that there needs to be manifestation of righteousness in the judiciary, that it is impermissible to verbally abuse anyone, that there is a duty to rescue in situations in which any person finds their life being threatened, that there is a duty resting upon persons who have the capacity to rescue them without significant threat to themselves, that they have a duty to rescue, that it is impermissible to hate people, that there is a duty of chastisement in a situation in which you believe someone is doing something wrong. Instead of simply hating that they are doing something wrong, you have a duty to chastise the wrongdoer. That it is impermissible to take vengeance, either in action or in speech. And that there is a duty to love every person. And the conclusion of that entire sequence is God's declaring, Ani Hashem, I am God. That is, God mandates to do all of that, mandates us to do all of that. Right? That's the kind of society that the Torah mandates us to create. So, and clearly, I mean, the Torah assumes that responsibility for these standards, responsibility for the ethical standards of a society, is not only the responsibility of government. Responsibility for the moral character of a society is the responsibility of every citizen. That's why every citizen of Sodom was responsible for what Sodom was doing. Every citizen of Shechem was responsible for what Shechem was doing. The prophets consistently warned the Jewish people that every single citizen is responsible for the corruption, both the spiritual and the material and the human corruption that exists within the society. That no one has the right to say, well, I did not do that particular act, but your society did. So what are we to do when we live in a society in which in which the protection of life of citizens is not to begin with equal? I mean, are you all aware of the degree of disparity that exists between the lifespan of whites and blacks in the United States? So that across the country, the disparity in lifespan is in excess of 7 years. In excess of 7 years. You know what part of the United States has the highest disparity? The highest disparity is found in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., the disparity between the lifespan of whites and blacks is in excess of 13 years for males, in excess of 8 years for females. Right? Do you understand what that means? Right? I mean, the lifespan of people, disparity in the capital of the United States, that the character of healthcare that is available to people, the character of quality of life, of safety, results in a 13-year gap in lifespan, right? I mean, what does it mean for us to be citizens in a society in which that's the case? What does it mean to be a citizen in a society in which 1 of 5 children in the country grow up in poverty? What does it mean to be a citizen of a country in which educational opportunity is radically unequal? Right now, New York City, in which I am located, I'm sitting right here in the middle of New York City. New York City has one of the most segregated educational systems of the entire country. You know, what does it mean to be a citizen in a country in which the value of life is clearly not equal for all citizens? When there are people in the country who can't even acknowledge that the risk to certain citizens is greater than to other citizens, and that therefore they say you should not even be able to say Black Lives Matter. As if anyone as if it would occur to anyone who says Black Lives Matter that only Black Lives Matter, that you have to insist that no, all lives matter. The reality is that when the lives of a particular segment of the society are under distinctive threat, we have a responsibility to call out that threat and to acknowledge that that distinctive threat exists. It doesn't mean that those lives are more valuable than anyone else's lives, but it also can't be allowed for us to allow the society to think that some lives are less significant than other lives. What does it mean to live in a society in which voting rights guaranteed by the Constitution are not granted, are consciously undermined by political entities in the country? What does it mean for us to be living in a society in which the degrees of dehumanization of social and other forms of indignity, whether it be in prison policies, in housing, right? On an average night in the United States right now, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people are sleeping in the streets. So what are the responsibility of citizens? I mean, after all, no one of us can heal all of that, right? No one of us has the capacity or the power or the authority to heal all of that. So what does Torah teach us about what our responsibilities are as citizens when we live in a society in which there is some evil? That doesn't mean that there's no good in American society. There's enormous goodness in American society. There's enormous goodness in the citizenry of American society. The levels of goodness in the churches and the synagogues, in the religious institutions, in the nonprofit institutions, in the willingness of people to go out of their way to help is enormous. But does that mean that we close our eyes to the areas of deficiency? So the Torah tells us, in fact, in one of the verses that I just referred to in chapter 19 of Leviticus, of Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol, you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind. So Jewish sages already more than 2,000 years ago said, you know, this obviously does not have anything to do with putting out blocks of wood or bricks in the street and causing blind people to fall, because it doesn't make any difference whether that's done to blind people or to people who are not blind. You're not allowed to cause injury to people. If you're not allowed to cause injury to people, it doesn't matter how you would cause or to whom you would cause, you're not allowed to cause injury to people. So what does the Torah mean when it says you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind? To which the sage's response was, this is not talking about blocks of wood out in the street. It doesn't mean digging ditches in the street for people to fall into and injure themselves. It has to do with people who are blind to their spiritual or moral responsibilities. And lo titein michshol, not placing a stumbling block before them, means that we should not be complicit in what they are doing, that we have a responsibility to hold people accountable for what they are doing, that we have a responsibility to hold government and office holders responsible. How do we do that? Well, the first way in which we do that is by recognizing that voting is not just a privilege in America. Right? It's one of the critical differences between sort of most Western legal systems and Jewish law is that most Western legal systems are built around notions of rights, right? So we're all proud of the fact that the Constitution of the United States, despite the controversy about it before it was adopted, right, contains the Bill of Rights. It tells you what the rights of citizens are, right? Jewish law is focused differently. Jewish law is focused not on rights. Jewish law is focused on duties. Now, it's true that duties and rights tend to be correlatives. If someone is granted a right, it means that the society as a whole or individual citizens have a duty to see to it that that right is implemented, that that right has the opportunity to be expressed. But there's an enormous difference in the emphasis. And by emphasizing, in Judaism, by emphasizing the duty that citizens have, what the Torah is attempting to do is to emphasize that we don't have a right to remain silent. Voting needs to be viewed Jewishly not only as a right, as a privilege, it needs to be viewed as a duty. We have a duty through our capacity to vote, to express to the leadership of the society, to express to the governing entities what we think is correct and what we think is not correct. And the failure to vote, the failure of usually in most elections in the United States of more than 50% of the population to vote is an extraordinarily criminal default in responsibility as citizens. And it's one that we ought not tolerate. And so Jewish law tells us through this law of Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol that, for example, 2,000 years ago, rabbinic law taught that it is not permissible to sell a gun, weapons, to someone who is suspect of possibly using it for a criminal offense, because then you would be complicit in that. You would have made the crime possible, right? That it is impermissible, Jewish law taught, that it is impermissible to buy stolen goods. Why is it impermissible to buy stolen goods? Because if there's no market for stolen goods, then people wouldn't steal those goods to sell them. Right? If they ended up valueless because they couldn't be sold, people wouldn't be stealing them. And so people who buy stolen goods are essentially encouraging the theft. And that constitutes placing a stumbling block before the blind. Loyalty to the society does not mean supporting the evils that society does. It means exercising the vote to assume responsibility to communicate that those are evils. You know, it's interesting. The Constitution of the United States has something to say about protest, right? The very first amendment. Amendment number 1 contains freedom of religion, speech, and the press, right? That Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of abridging the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What does that mean? What is this right of assembly that the Constitution is talking about in order to petition the government for a redress of grievances? It's talking about the right to engage in protest, the right to inform the government that unequivocally we have gathered to indicate that there is an unacceptable condition here that we need to be able to correct, and that you, who are our elected officers, need to work at correcting. If this were to be expressed in Jewish law, it would not be expressed this way. It would be expressed not as a right of citizens to gather and to petition their government to redress grievances. It would be formulated as a duty of citizens to engage in protest, as the duty of citizens to petition government for a redress of grievances. You know, Jewish law worked, the Torah worked very hard to eliminate any notion of vicarious liability. That is, you know, the Torah says, in contrast to most ancient societies, you know, used to use vicarious punishment. Certainly in the ancient world, in ancient Assyria and Babylonia, right? In Hammurabi's code, for example, where a contractor built the building and the building collapsed and killed the child of the householder. And Hammurabi's code says that the court then has to investigate the matter to determine whether the contractor had used shoddy materials. And if it's established that the contractor had used shoddy materials, then the contractor is found guilty for that death. And the penalty is that the child of the contractor has to be killed. Right? And most legal systems in antiquity saw sort of that kind of vicarious punishment as perfectly acceptable. The Torah did not. The Torah declared that lo yumtu avot al banim, parents should not be punished for the crimes of their children. V'lo yumtu banim al avotam, and children should not be punished for the crimes of their parents. Ish bechet o yumat. Each individual can be punished only for his or her own crime. But there's a difference between punishment for crime and responsibility for the country's actions. Nobody should be held responsible for somebody else's crime, right? Whoever it was, whoever those people were who beat a police officer to death in the attack on Congress need to be punished individually. And there's no justification for holding, all thousands of people who are there accountable for that, gruesome act. But when it comes to the conduct of government and the character of the society within which we live, Torah insists that every individual bears responsibility to do whatever he or she can within the limits of their capacity, but within the context of an honest evaluation of what it is that needs to be done in the society, and responding to the question of what can I do to make a difference in relation to these areas of societal conduct. And I think that every one of us needs to take that seriously. That for every one of us, as I said at the outset, no one of us can remedy this litany of problems that American society confronts. But every one of us can make a contribution of some sort to the betterment of something in all of that. It may be, has to be in how we vote. It ought to be in how we participate in public protests or in signing petitions. In whatever form for each one of us, in the condition in which we live, there needs to be an honest cheshbon hanefesh, an honest self-evaluation as to whether we are doing at least what we can to attempt to remedy these evils. And voting and protest are themselves critical elements of the instruments that are available to every one of us and that we need to exercise. So, over the course of many years, I have participated in demonstrations of, in demonstrations against restriction of free speech and demonstrations against school segregation. And I've been involved in activities on behalf of the cessation of oppression of Soviet Jewry when that was taking place, and opposition to anti-Semitism in America and in other countries. Participated in protests against the sale of AWACS to Saudi Arabia, and our government is about to again sell huge quantities of deadly weapons to a country that has wiped out half of Yemen. And participated in demonstrations, have been arrested at demonstrations for Israel and against Arafat speaking at the United Nations, and against the Vietnam War and against the war in Vietnam, and in opposition to the genocide in Darfur, I've done other things as well besides demonstrations, and I know that my contributions in any one of those areas have been just very tiny, right? Just really very tiny. But I know that I've at least attempted through my life to recognize the presence of wrongdoing and to attempt to stand up against it. And I believe that that's a fundamental responsibility of every Jew. It's a fundamental responsibility, I believe, of every human being on this earth. And so with that, let me open to questions. I'll be glad to respond to whatever questions you have.
A reminder to everyone is you can put a question in the chat if you don't want to use your voice, or you can ask a question on video.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So, when you were talking about the rules, in that one set of rules, I was very much reminded of the Ten Commandments.
That's right.
So I'm kind of wondering if they are, in a sense, a deeper statement of Ten Commandments.
Well, what I believe they are is, already back in the first century before the Common Era, Philo, who was a leading Jewish scholar in Alexandria in Egypt, recognized that the 10 Commandments were not just 10 laws, but that the 10 Commandments constituted sort of the most fundamental categories of law. And he, in fact, then used the 10 Commandments as a way of categorizing all of the laws of the Torah, classifying all of the laws of the Torah. So I think your intuition was correct. That is, that what this list of regulation, of these laws are, is a translation of the principles of the 10 Commandments into action through law. Right? That is, law is an attempt to concretize the basic values of the society. And the 10 Commandments includes a lot of the basic value, the basic truths that the society believes in, right? That all people are created equal because we were all created by just a single God. One God created all of us, and therefore we all are entitled to equality, right? That the legislation of the Sabbath essentially eliminates economic power because it makes it possible for everybody to rest, right? Nobody is a complete slave without entitlement to rest, right? That the prohibition against taking human life, right, is an affirmation of the fundamental value of human life, right? The prohibition against theft is an affirmation of the respect for private property. But all of that needs to be translated into rules that people understand as regulating all sorts of areas of their conduct in the society. And this section of chapter 19 of Leviticus is precisely a part of that process of the translation of those principles into rules for the governance of the lives of individuals and of the governance of the lives of society. So you're quite correct in making that association. Anyone else?
I have a question, Rabbi.
Sure, Omega.
When talking to somebody across faith about the expectations of voting and protest, how can we accurately and emphatically get the same point across, even if they have a different value system?
No, I mean, it seems to me that virtually everything that I have said, perhaps not emphasized in quite the same way in terms of, let's say, the duty-rights distinction, but virtually everything that I have said would be consented to by anyone within Judaism or Christianity or Islam, by virtually every Buddhist, and Hindus as well. There is virtually no religious order in the world today that does not have a fundamental sense of the nature of human responsibility toward other human beings. We may have different ways in which we express it and different ways of placing emphasis on them. And, Judaism has its distinctive emphasis on law, has its distinctive emphasis on sort of the consciousness of that sort of the presence of God in the life of the individual and the life of the society, just shared in Christianity, to a certain extent shared in Islam, although in a slightly different way. And in Buddhism, it takes on a different character. But, I don't know that there is anyone who would be able to say that anything that I had said is offensive to their understanding of their religious responsibilities. But I think what has happened is that American society has become so sort of self-centered, so centered on the right of the individual instead of the responsibility of the society, that even people within the religious traditions are simply not thinking that way. And I think what we just need to do is to call to people's attention the ways in which the correspondences, for example, between rights and duties, I think people have an intuitive understanding that every right that you have also creates a duty. Right? That every right that you have creates a duty. Why so? Well, for the simplest reason that if everybody shares in that right, then the only way in which everyone can have that right is if everyone perceives it as their duty to assure that that right is extended to everybody. Because if anyone can be deprived of that right, then everyone can be deprived of the right. So, I think there is an intuitive sense that that's true, but people are, the orientation of the society is orientation of American society and generally of Western society is deeply individualistic, not sufficiently communal in character, and is deeply focused on material gratification rather than on a sense of responsibility for shared society. And so I think we need to call on people to recognize that these are part of fundamental religious drives that they need to undertake, both for themselves and for their communities.
Do you think this is, in large part, a failure of education currently? That we are not educating our children properly so that they understand these things?
Education of children is part of it. I think that the public education system has, in large measure, forfeited its responsibility for moral education. That doesn't mean that every school or that every teacher has done that. There are certainly teachers who attempt, in whatever it is that they're teaching, whether they're teaching science or they're teaching history or they're teaching, social studies or they're teaching literature. There are certainly individual teachers who understand that they bear a responsibility for the transmission of the values of the culture. And that those values of the culture are deeply embedded in our literature, in our modes of governance, in our history, and that they have a responsibility to elicit those and to convey them to the next generation. But, partly out of fear of particularism, the educational systems as a whole have not placed sufficient emphasis on moral teachings because they're afraid that they're really religious teachings. And if they're really religious, they shouldn't be teaching religion. If they shouldn't be teaching religion, then maybe they're not allowed to teach love thy neighbor as thyself, right? Well, love thy neighbor as thyself is a fundamental moral teaching that is as innate in American society as it is in the Bible. And the refusal to teach it, because it's a religious teaching and we don't teach religion, is a default and a fundamental responsibility. But it's far more than just the educational system. It's what the adults in the society portray to their children in terms of what are the most important aspirations. Look at the recent scandals around people, buying places for their children in Harvard and Yale and Princeton and U of P, by bribing people. So what does that say? What does it say when in the society it is so overtly the case that wealth establishes the basis for respect, and that inner human qualities don't nearly as much? Right? What does it say when the society cherishes external beauty to the exclusion of internal virtues? Right? These are, I think, fundamental problems. And the public relations field, I believe, bears a significant piece of the responsibility for that, because they have managed to prey, P-R-E-Y, to prey on people's sort of instinctive sense that wealth and power and beauty are the only things that matter. And therefore that if they want to sell anything, right, nowadays, doesn't matter what you're selling. I mean, you can be selling, a pen, and the way you sell it is by appealing to people's sense that if they have that pen, it will mean they will become wealthy and powerful and beautiful. Because only wealthy, powerful, and beautiful people use that pen, right? I mean, it's a level of material corruption that deeply undermines the significance of virtues, deeply undermines the significance of individual responsibility. And if the country lets a president of the United States get away, you will excuse me, and this is not intended politically, it's intended as simply a moral statement. If the government of our country allows the president of the country to get away with the encouragement and of violent, seditious actions, what will that say to the country? What will that say to young people as well as old people about, what degree of disrespect the government itself has for its own stated values, right? I mean, this Constitution, right? This very Constitution, which in the 14th Amendment, right? In the 14th Amendment, correct? So in the 14th Amendment said that nobody can be precluded from running for office in this country except a person who shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the government, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So, we've lost our way. I mean, I can't put it in any other way. And it will take, an enormous effort on the part of the citizenry as a whole to vote differently, to protest differently. And, it doesn't mean that all protests have been good and healthy. I mean, there have been protests, which have been undermined by people engaging in violence and by people engaging in, I'm not ready to say that every person who was present even at that protest at Congress was evil and corrupt. We're not, but there were unfortunately enough people there who were willing to lead that crowd into stuff that they might never have done on their own. That's talk about not placing a stumbling block before the blind. One of the ways you place a stumbling block before the blind is by getting someone all sort of agitated about something sufficiently to do something that they would otherwise never think of doing. But when led into doing it, they'll follow the leader. We all know that. Think about the way kids act when a bully starts bullying somebody, and how much effort it takes to train our own children to resist the bully and not to join in the bullying. Because the natural temptation is sort of to join in the bullying against the vulnerable person. And kids will often instinctively do that. When they see, a vulnerable person being bullied, that they'll sort of join in with it instead of standing up for the victim. And it takes an enormous amount of effort on the part of parents, on the part of teachers, on the part of the whole of the society to teach people that, that you can't do that. That you have to stand up for the vulnerable and not allow the bullies to get their way. But our society has not been doing that, and we need to get people to vote for different kinds of people. We need to get people to vote in a way that really holds people accountable for how they are acting in governance. And we have to evolve ways of assuring more effectively that our effective protests don't get undermined by people who want to profit off the violence that those protests may make possible.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman.
Kent Rabbi, welcome. It's good to see you. If you're still there, more than just your picture. Okay.
No, I am here. I just
Okay.
my cat keeps walking across my lap, so it's good to see you too.
Okay, it's really good to see you.
Rabbi Berman, I know we don't really have more than a minute left, but I do see that a question was asked. Maybe you can't sum up the entire civil rights movement in 1 minute. Certainly not your experience in Selma, but I do want to honor Mark's question where he was asking about the rest of your experience in Selma.
Well, you're correct. I mean, I certainly can't encapsulate that in 1 minute. On the other hand, there's one piece of that experience that has stayed with me. I mean, there are many pieces of that experience that have stayed with me and that have influenced my life in many different ways. Even though I really, in all candor, it's only, these last 4 years that I have at all spoken about my experiences in Selma. It was mine and it influenced me, but I chosen never to speak about it. In any case, there's one piece of that experience that was extraordinarily important. And I won't tell you how I arrived at this understanding, but I'll just tell you what understanding I arrived at. And that is, I arrived at the understanding that you can't help people unless you're really ready to listen to them. There's a kind of hubris that exists in the helping professions to a certain extent generally, but particularly in sort of nonprofit kind of aids to the poor and to the vulnerable, and that is that the sponsors of such organizations and activities know exactly what needs to be done. And all people have to do is like listen to them, and then everything will be perfect, right? The truth of the matter is, none of us know exactly what needs to be done. If we really all knew what needed to be done, then there would be no homelessness and there would be no poverty. And the reality is that we don't know how to solve these problems simply, but that the most fundamental thing that we can do is listen to people, to understand what it is that they are experiencing in life. And out of that, be able to help them help us to help them. Because without their helping us to help them, nothing that we do will help. That's a lesson that I learned sort of at the very tail end of my visit. And that has remained with me, and I try as much as possible to sort of catch myself, to sort of stop myself from saying, oh, I know how to solve that problem, right? I can help you, right? And instead to try to just listen to people and then work with them on, okay, what could I do that would be helpful? What do you think could be helpful to you? I'll try to do what you think could be helpful to you, as long as I agree that it's got a chance. I mean, I'm not going to do stuff that's really stupid, but I'm going to do stuff that people, intuit themselves need to be done for them. So that's a piece of what I learned. I should add, there was one other sort of negative piece that I learned. I did not have the opportunity in the final event to actually participate in the march beyond the Pettus Bridge, because that was limited. They limited that, in the agreement between Martin Luther King and President Johnson. They limited that to only a couple of thousand people who were able to actually march, and there were tens of thousands of people who had gathered in order to march, and so most of us weren't able to march. So I marched. So from the beginning, the outset of the march in Selma to the Pettus Bridge. At the edge of the Pettus Bridge, on both sides of the street, there were cars lined up. And at one of those cars, there was a young couple, youngish couple, standing on sort of opposites on the two sides of the of the doors of the car facing where the marchers were. And there were two children inside the car, a little boy and a little girl. They may have been, 10 or 11 or 9 or something like that. And each one of them hanging out a window, one of the windows. And I noticed as I was walking from a distance already, I noted that the kids would scream at the marchers, but I wasn't able to catch what they were screaming. And as I got closer, I realized that every time they saw a black and a white walking together, they would scream at the white person, "You are a traitor to your race." Right? You're a traitor to your race. And I knew that those words were not coming out of 9 and 11-year-old children, right? But they were speaking those words. And I realized that having had that experience at that point in their lives, that it will take another whole generation, at least, before we've got even a fighting chance of any kind of recognition of the depths of the pervasive sort of systemic racial bias that exists in the country. And it was a deeply depressing note on which I ended my visit, even though there were all of these other things that I had experienced that made me very hopeful. So those are some of the things that I learned. Okay. Any other questions, or where our time is gone? Okay. Again, thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Omega, and thank you, Harold, for having extended the invitation to me and for having given me the opportunity to meet and speak with people. Thank you all very much.
Rabbi Berman, next year we'll be back at Taganic, God willing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please kiss your beautiful babies for us. And
I
send
will.
them regards to your husband.
They send their love.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Take care, everybody. Be well.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Rabbi.